ever since the concept was first brought into the world at large in April of 1938, superheroes have continued to be popular. I know. Stick with me. I promise it's going to be great. To give you an idea of just the seismic shift created by how well Action Comics #1, which featured the debut of Superman, sold, within a week of that having come out, every comic book publisher was pushing their artists and their writers to create the next Superman. To the point that now when we hear the word comic books, we automatically associate that with superheroes. Never mind the fact that before April of 1938, comic books spanned the genre of landscape. There were comic books on everything and everyone. There was detectives, there was thrillers, there was comedy, there was horror, there was all sorts of other things that comic books spanned. And ever since 1938, there have always been comics that have had nothing to do with superheroes or anything like that, but they never sell as well as the brightly colored crusaders trying to save the day. And it really didn't take long for the concept of superheroes to expand far beyond the realm of comic books. It was something that exploded into the place of all sorts of other types of media. In 1940, just 2 months shy of his second anniversary, Superman leapt off the pages of comic books and hit the radio waves. In 1941, he was seen for the very first time in animation. In 1948, he was featured in movie serials, which were basically like episodic television before television, that blended live action and animation. Every time Superman would fly, it would switch to a cartoon of Superman flying, which by today's standards sounds a little hokey and corny, but back then it was cutting-edge technology. In 1952, he made his very first live-action television appearance. And by 1978, Superman would make his first appearance in a full-length feature film bearing his name. Altogether, since 1938, Superman has appeared in 10 animated series, 13 animated movies dedicated just to him, 7 live-action series, television series, and 10 live-action movies. And that's just Superman. To say nothing of Batman and Spider-Man and all the other spandex brigade that have existed on our comic books. That's not bad for just 88 years of the concept itself existing in the landscape. And it seems like the popularity of superheroes has hit a fever pitch in the last 20 years or so. As comic book movies have been coming out almost every other week, it's felt like. There was actually a time period just before recent events where it kind of seemed like the comic book craze was coming to an end, and then the new Spider-Man hit theaters. And it's made well over $1 billion. It's the first one to do that in like 6 years or so. So it seems like the trajectory of superheroes is that it's going to continue to go on forever and ever. In fact, out of the top 25 highest grossing movies of all time, 8 of them had their start as superhero comic books. That's a lot of money coming your way. Superheroes have captured the imagination of people, not just here in the United States where they originated, but all around the world. They have kind of integrated themselves into the cultural landscape. What once was considered to be nerdy and kind of for a certain demographic has become the cultural conversation to the point that we don't seem to be able to get enough of them. And really, it shouldn't be that surprising that the idea of a superpowered or supernatural individual saving the day is something that is new or different for us, because that's actually something that's existed well before the funny pages. It has been a part of the cultural fiber of so many different cultures throughout time. There have always been a call for more stories of people who are willing to step up and fight oppression, or are willing to use their powers and abilities to help save other people. We see it throughout history and literature. Guys like Beowulf, Odysseus, King Arthur, Robin Hood, Hercules, Don Quixote, Zorro, Sherlock Holmes. We could keep going until I'm blue in the face. Because all throughout history, there have always been a call for us to read and captivate ourselves in stories about people who have powers and abilities that you and I could only ever dream of. we find ourselves captivated to figure out what is it like to be this person? What would it be like to have that power and that ability ourselves? What would it be like to be the hero who saves the day? And so we find ourselves immersing ourselves in those types of stories of these people who do these heroic acts or these supernatural things that we just find ourselves overwhelmingly captivated by. Everybody loves the hero. And for a long time in my life, that's exactly how the story of Samson was presented to me, as a conquering hero with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. And it really wasn't until I was reaching adulthood and I read over the Samson story again that I began to understand Samson's not a good guy. Samson is not the kind of person that we want to emulate ourselves after. He just happens to be a guy who God blessed with an uncanny level of strength. We find Samson's story in Judges chapter 13 through 16, so if you want to get there in your Bibles, we got a lot to cover today. And like we've said all throughout this series, we're not going to be able to cover everything involving Samson's story, even with us extending it to 2 weeks. So, spoiler for next week, I guess. We're still going to talk about Samson next week. But even with that, 2 weeks of sermons on Samson, we're still not going to be able to cover everything in Samson's life. So I challenge you, go home this week, read over these chapters again for yourselves, so that way you get to familiarize yourself with the story. But where we kind of left things off last week, the Israelites, it seems like, as we've seen over and over and over again, they cannot seem to break themselves out of the cycle of constant idol worship and chasing after false gods and a host of other problems and issues that we can only describe as being sinful in nature. It seemed like for at least a little while that things were going to change. And it seemed that way with Gideon, who we discussed last week. If you recall, we talked about the first instance that Gideon, or the first thing that Gideon did after getting the call from God, was he went and he cut down the Asherah poles and he destroyed the altar of Baal, the two predominant foreign gods that the Israelites had fallen under the spell of, if you will. And he did this as kind of a big reset for the Israelites to say, no, we're going to only chase after the God of Israel, and we're going to only pursue him, and we're going to become that theocracy that he always envisioned us to be, because that's what we need to do. Because every time we've fallen into this, we even got word of a prophet last week telling them the reason why these terrible things keep happening to you is because you keep doing this. So stop it. And so for a moment, it seemed like things were finally going to take a turn. You'd be forgiven for assuming that after Gideon, that surely that was the instance where the Israelites finally said, enough. But then we get to Judges 8, verse 33, and not only do we find out that, no, they're going to continue to fall into these problems, you almost get the impression that the writer of Judges is a little fed up with it too, because his language is a little stronger. It says, as soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Can you say that word in church? Yes, I can, because it's in the Bible. But you got to be kidding me. I mean, for 40 years they had peace under Gideon because Gideon kept them pointed towards the God of Israel, the one who got them in the promised land to begin with. For 40 years, they finally had a break from the cycle of pain and suffering and oppression that they found themselves in over and over and over again. But I'll remind you, as we've said numerous times, really since the start of the year, that when the Bible specifically mentions 40 years, it is talking about a generational point. So one generation finally gets peace. But then, we have to pick things up after this. And it seemed like after this moment that things progressively get worse. And again, as we've talked about this entire series, how could it possibly get worse? But it does. One of my family's favorite television shows that we love to watch is a show called Arrested Development. If you ever watch it, just watch seasons 1 through 3. Don't watch the revitalized seasons 4 and 5. They're terrible. Seasons 1 through 3 are fantastic, though, and the humor of that is watching this family like just make terrible decision after terrible decision. You leave an episode going, how could it possibly get worse? And then the next episode happens, and it's hilarious. This stopped being funny, though, like 5 chapters ago for me. Because things get worse for the Israelites. You get the short judgment of Abimelech, who is one of Gideon's sons. And we read that he actually took that position through some fairly nefarious means. Up until now, every judge that we've discussed has been appointed by God himself. Abimelech became judge through conspiracy and coercion. Sounds like a great guy. But then you get the judgment of Jephthah and his tragic vow that he makes. And I honestly thought about taking a week and just talking about Jephthah. But, again, for time reasons, we're not doing that. So if you go back and you read Jephthah's story for yourself and you've never read it before, allow me to point out to you that at no point does God ask him to make a vow in the first place. At no point does God himself say, Jephthah, make this vow to me. God does not say that. And secondly, God does not ask him to follow through on his vow. Jephthah makes that decision himself. So when you read that story and you read about that tragic vow, I'm not going to spoil it for you. You get to read it for yourself. Please, please, please know that at no point does God ask for it or demand that it be followed through on. Once again, I'll remind you the Bible is descriptive, meaning that it tells us what happens. It is not inherently prescriptive in these stories. So as we continue to look at what's going on in Israel's history, we see that they are going through judges left and right. Shortly after Jephthah, who only reigned for 6 years himself, you get Ibzah, Elon, and Abdon, none of whom sit in judgment for more than 10 years. So they are getting a constant fluctuation and changes in leadership, and it's creating all sorts of confusion as to who is our political leader, who is the one that we're supposed to be coming to. And it's during that time, it's worth noting that at no point from Gideon on do the Israelites cry out to God again. Every part of this cycle has been the Israelites fall into sinful behavior. God sends an outside nation or allows an outside nation to come and oppress them. They cry out to God. God sends a judge. After Gideon, the Israelites don't cry out to God anymore. And I think that that's indicative of just how far separated they have become. How far away from God they've allowed themselves to walk. And this is just not a great situation for them to be in. It's almost as if they've kind of decided themselves that this is just how it's going to be. They've learned to live with the oppression that they're facing. And it's in that spirit of hopelessness in this cycle, without turning to God, that Samson's story begins. And it begins in kind of the same way that we should be used to. At this point in time, the first part of this verse should just be considered the theme song to every episode of Judges. It says in chapter 13, verse 1, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." How many times can you possibly read the same thing without pulling your hair out? But this time, the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines, and don't miss this part, do not miss this part, for 40 years. Isn't it interesting that the people of Israel no longer cry out to God, and so God allows them to be oppressed for literally twice as long as the longest one that we've faced thus far? This is twice as long as Deborah and Barak from a couple of weeks ago, where they were under oppression for 20 years. God is now allowing them to be oppressed by the Philistines, who kind of become, from this point forward, really the villains of the Old Testament, right? Like they're the Lex Luthor of these guys, if we want to go back to our Superman illustration. And of course, I'm going to go back to the Superman illustration. They become the primary antagonist from really this point forward for them, until Babylon, really. But this is faced by 40 years. And again, we already said it once today, 40 years in Scripture signifies what? A generation. So an entire generation lives under the oppressive behavior of the Philistines. They are constantly living in this situation to the point that an entire generation, this is all we know. Dealing with the Philistines and the headache that they keep causing us is just seemingly the only way we know how to live. And it's in that moment that God decides, without the Israelites calling to him, I'm going to do something about this. And he does so by actually starting with Samson's mother. She had been barren throughout her entire marriage to Manoah, Samson's father, until she's told by an angel that she's going to give birth to a son. And the more I think about it, the more I think it might be really interesting to do a sermon series on literally all of the miraculous births in Scripture, because there are a lot more than you think there are. So this could be fun. But she's told something significant about this child in verses 4 and 5. It says, "Therefore be careful, and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean, for behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Now, the Nazirite vow is something that would have made a lot of sense in this culture. Something that the Israelites themselves would have instantly known about, because it is part of Israel's culture and history. In fact, in Numbers chapter 6, you get the full layout of what it means to be a Nazirite. It means to be set apart from God. And as far as your side of fulfilling it, there's a lot of things that Moses talks about in Numbers 6. Excuse me. I almost said Moses 6. That would have been weird. But in Numbers 6, it basically boils down to three things that every Nazirite needs to follow. If you're under the Nazirite vow, you need to follow these three things. Don't drink alcohol or other strong drinks. Moses actually put vinegar. Who's drinking vinegar? I mean, like sometimes if I got a sour tummy, Mandy makes me drink apple cider vinegar. I don't like it. I do everything I can to avoid it, but don't drink alcohol. That's a big one. Second one is don't touch anything that's dead. Now, what that means is most of the time, if your family member passed away in your house, you would be the one responsible for carrying the body out, right? They didn't have undertakers. They didn't have morticians then. You were the one responsible for getting the preparations made for the body. It just meant that you had to live with a period of being unclean afterwards. If you're under the Nazirite vow, even if it's your mom and dad, you are not allowed to touch the dead body. You have to hire out somebody else to come and take care of your own dead. Do not touch anything that is dead. It doesn't just apply to dead human beings. It applies to anything that's dead. Don't touch it. And the third one, don't cut your hair. I'm good with that with the beard. I don't want to cut the beard, but my hair grows to a certain point and it starts curling out, and I look like a little Dutch boy. So I'd have a problem with the don't cut your hair part of it. But, for some of you, hey, you're good with that. That's cool. I always thought it'd be cool to have a ponytail, but, or a mullet. Mandy won't let me grow a mullet, though. We are off track. Anyway, so the Nazirite vow comes out to don't drink alcohol or strong drinks, don't cut your hair, and don't touch anything that's dead. Do me a favor. Keep those three things in mind, because I promise you, they're going to come up. Samson eventually is born. It is fulfilled as the angel says. It says in verses 24 and 25, "And the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Manadan between Zorah and Eshtal." And as great as this moment is, as a woman who's been barren her entire life is finally giving birth to a son, knowing that this son is going to be someone special, someone who's going to do some incredible things for the nation of Israel to finally help get them out from underneath the Philistines, it doesn't take long for the story to start taking a tragic turn. Because in Judges 14, Samson has reached adulthood, and more than that, he's found the woman that he wants to marry. Aww. But it's not exactly somebody the parents are excited or happy to welcome into the family, because she's a Philistine. The people who've been oppressing us for an entire generation. Samson wants to marry into that group. And it's not that mom and dad are against this purely based on any sort of semblance of racism. That may be a part of it, but that's not the only reason why this is the case. See, the Philistines, like the Canaanites and the Midianites and all the other oppressing groups and foreign nations that the Israelites have been under, they also chase after foreign gods and false idols. And his parents have known since before his birth that he is supposed to be set apart in service to the God of Israel. And so they are likely more concerned with the idea of our son, who is supposed to be the hero of his people, who's supposed to be the one to usher us back into worship of our God, that maybe he might fall into idol worship himself. And what would that create? And so they ask him very sternly, very sincerely, but they are given a rather blunt answer in chapter 14, verse 3. It says, "But his father and his mother said to him, 'Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?' But Samson said to his father, 'Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes.'" It's that right in my eyes thing that we all just kind of struggle with a little bit, isn't it? She's right in my eyes. So as they're heading to her town, one of the most infamous stories of Samson's life occurs. In verses 5 and 6, we read, "Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came towards him roaring. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done." I like that it says, "as one tears a young goat," like that's an everyday occurrence. Like, oh, I had no idea what that was like, but I've tore a young goat before. It's weird. But dude just killed a lion barehanded, right? Like, I mean, you can understand why we tell this story to small kids in Sunday school, right? He had his bare hands and he ripped that lion apart. That's a wild story, an amazing display of strength of what God can do for it. And so there's a part of you that would be forgiven to say, man, this story is awesome. I want to be just like Samson, until you get a little further down. Because in verses 9, he makes a decision. It says he scraped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. He came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate, but he did not tell them that he scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. Dude came back to the area where he had killed that lion. He noticed, hey, there are some bees that are making some honey in its body. And so it says he scraped it from the carcass of the lion. But what is a Nazirite not supposed to touch? Dead things. Uh-oh. We might be in a little bit of trouble here. Things with that Philistine woman, they sort of progress. And in verse 10, we're actually informed that Samson's father prepares the wedding feast. And something that we need to understand about this culture and this time period is that when a wedding took place, it was not just a one-day event like it is for us. Right? Like if you get invited to a wedding, you know that Saturday's gone. Like that's just the end of the day. But it's so nice. Anyway, but in their time period, it would actually be held through a feast. And depending on how wealthy your parents were, that feast could extend itself all the way up to about a week, sometimes more, but that would usually be reserved for royalty. We're told in the text that Samson's wedding feast lasts 7 days. So it's a pretty nice wedding that's going on here. Samson's dad's got some money. Of course, he was childless for a long period of his life, so that's probably why. But my kids aren't in here, are they? Okay, cool, we're good. But he spent a lot of money on this wedding, and it's fairly common, especially, and we see this with Jesus' very first miracle at the wedding in Cana. It's very common that as part of that festivities would be a ton of wine. It would be free-flowing for anyone to enjoy. And the text never explicitly says Samson himself partake of the wine. Easy for me to say. But Samson does make a bet with some dudes that if they can solve his riddle before the end of the wedding, he'll give them 30 cloaks. But if they don't, they have to give him 30 cloaks. And to me, that doesn't sound like the sort of bet that one makes when they're sober. All kidding aside, every biblical scholar I could find seems to agree that the text at least heavily implies that Samson is drinking wine at this wedding. And what's another part of the Nazirite vow? Don't drink alcohol. We're having some trouble here following the rules of the vow that we've been under our entire lives, are we not? But it gets worse somehow in a story that's also awesome. I'll explain. Things between the Philistines and Samson continue to go back and forth. And ultimately, the wedding to this Philistine woman doesn't work out. In fact, you could say that the whole relationship sort of flames out. And if you know the story, that's a joke. So, like 10 of you got that. Good. The rest of you, read your Bibles. But in one particular confrontation, we see Samson do something incredible and, again, also terrible at the same time. In Judges 15, verse 15, it says, "And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and he put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men." While it's cool that one guy took on 1,000 dudes, he had to touch a dead thing to get it. So that's two instances now already where we're seeing that the Nazirite vow to Samson doesn't seem to mean as much as it probably should. Right? If you hear the words making a vow to somebody, that means that they're making a very serious promise, that they're going to commit themselves to it, or at least that's what it should mean to us. We've seen in our own culture that, it can change. But for Samson to continually break the confines of his Nazirite vow over and over again. Yes, well, it's cool. He took down 1,000 dudes just with the jawbone of a donkey. It means he had to break the Nazirite vow in order to make that happen. It shows, it really seems to dictate to us that Samson does not have the tightest of relationships with God. And in fact, we see even further evidence of that just after this, because we get one of only two prayers of Samson that are ever recorded in Scripture in verse 18. It says, "He was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, 'You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?'" What a guy. Right? Samson is seeming to live under the delusion that he has been able to do all of these incredible things under his own power. I got to think that Manoah and his mom told him the story of how we knew you were going to be a thing. That you were supposed to be set apart by God, and that God was going to give you the strength and the ability to free us from the Philistines. But Samson has learned to rely on the gift without returning thanks to the giver of the gift. Samson is taking all of the credit for himself to say, look at how amazing I am. Even in this prayer, he is saying, you've granted this salvation by the hand of your servant. Meaning that by my hand, not by anything God did, you have granted us this salvation. Samson comes across as very arrogant. Dare I even say prideful. Because he believes that it is only through his own power that he has been able to do all of this stuff. But we're still not finished. Because up until now, we've already seen Samson to be this arrogant man who does not seem to care much about the Nazirite vow that he has, because he believes, I have this strength, I'm always going to have this strength. But he seems to live in constant defiance of the God who gave him that strength. And soon his pride and his arrogance and his defiance of God are going to catch up to him. And they're going to cost him dearly. After his marriage to this Philistine woman, he eventually does find love again, but he does so in a woman named Delilah, who, once again, is not the kind of woman one wants to bring home to mom. Dude has a type for picking the worst ladies ever. Because Delilah is pursued by some of the lords of the Philistines, who at this point in time are just kind of over Samson. They want to find any way they can to get rid of him. They want to see if they can't find some sort of kryptonite for this dude. I'm going to keep tying everything back to Superman, so get used to that. I'm even thinking about it for next week. But she is offered by 5 of the Philistine lords to find out how it is that they can defeat him. And once they defeat him, they will each give her 1,100 shekels of silver. I didn't go to Bible college for math. I know, that's shocking, right? But just based off of my level, 5 guys giving you 1,100 shekels each comes out to 5,500 shekels of silver. Now that could mean all sorts of things to us, right? I could be saying 55 loonies, and you still have no idea what I'm talking about, but you wonder why I turned Canadian all of a sudden. If we were to kind of figure out how much money this would be in today's time period, 5,500 shekels of silver translates to roughly somewhere between $2.5 and $14 million. So it's a little bit more than egg money, right? And she's being offered this to betray the guy who loves her for some reason. $2.5 to $14 million to betray this guy who is absolutely crazy about you. For that kind of money, Mandy would at least think about it. You fool. Because we are talking about not just life-changing money, we're talking about generation-changing money. Right? This is the kind of money that's going to last her descendants and their descendants probably even. This is a huge amount of money all to betray this man. And so she starts working on it. When Samson comes around, Delilah asks him, how can you be bound? How can we stop you? How can you just tell me, baby? I just want to know, right? And so he tells her, well, it takes 7 fresh bowstrings. If I'm tied up by those, then I'll be useless. So then he falls asleep. And she gets out 7 fresh bowstrings and ties him up with it. What a nice girl. Then she calls out to him. He wakes up and he shreds the 7 fresh bowstrings. No problem. But Delilah's annoyed because this guy who claims to love me, he's not telling me how to beat him. So she asks again, and he says, well, if you use new rope, I'm done for. He falls asleep again. Dude must be tired. She ties him up. He wakes up. He snaps the rope. She tries again, because $2.5 and $14 million is a lot of money. So I'm going to keep trying. And this time he tells her that if she weaves the locks of his hair with a web and then pins them down, well, then he's done for. And we know that's not the case, but cutting it a little close here, aren't we, bud? We're getting a little too close to the grain. So he falls asleep, she does the thing, he wakes up, breaks out of it, no problem. And so finally Delilah, in her anger and her frustration, she pulls out probably the most manipulative card that she can in Judges chapter 16, verse 15. It says, and she said to him, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, for you have not told me where your great strength lies. Now I want to call time out for a second for the teenagers in this room. If the person that you are dating ever busts out the phrase, if you love me, you would, run. It sounds like I'm kidding. I'm not. I can't tell you how many stories I heard of girls particularly, but also guys, who were manipulated by the phrase, if you love me, you would. And I'm here to tell you, that ain't the one. Okay? So it's not just your mom and dad telling you, unless you're Robin or Adrian, in which case it's very much your dad telling you, but thanks. But don't mess with that, right? Because that's the most manipulative thing you could say. And unfortunately, in Samson's case, it works. Because he finally tells her, well, if you cut my hair, my strength is gone. He falls asleep. I would never fall asleep around this gal, given the fact that 3 times already this is like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times, I'm an idiot. Fool me 4 times, I probably deserve it, right? And it's really the end of verse 20 that's awfully telling for where Samson is at this point in his life. It says, and she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as the other times, and I shall shake myself free. But, that's a big one. But he did not know the Lord had left him. Pride is a plague on our hearts. Pride tells us that we are self-sufficient, that we don't need anyone's help. It even tells us sometimes that I know better than God. It's at the heart of literally every sinful act that we knowingly contribute to. When we enter into the activity or even into the thought that we know goes against what God's design is for us, what we are saying in that particular moment in our hearts is that I don't care what God wants. I want what I want. And if that's not the most arrogant, prideful thing that we could ever say, like that's like a washing machine saying, I know better than the manufacturer. I know better than the architect. That's an insane thing to think about, isn't it? And yet, that's what pride does to us, is it tells us we know better than God. But pride will always lead us into self-destruction. And please understand, I know that phrase of I don't care what God wants for me, I know better, that's a hard thing for us to wrap our minds around, but I am just as guilty as everybody else in this room because I've had that thought. I know for a fact that I've had that thought. I'm guessing that everybody in this room with a pulse has had that thought at least once. Maybe not Jenna, but she was just born. But every single one of us have had that thought of, I know better than God. If that's, we'll even disguise it by things, well, if that's what God says, then I don't want to follow after that God. Okay. But that's not going to work out well because pride always leads us to self-destruction. It's rarely something that happens right away, though. Because again, if we go back and we look at Samson's story up to this point, we've seen that time and time again, yes, Samson broke the Nazirite vow that he was told to follow from the day he was born. Yes, he broke it time and time again, but God still did amazing things through him. Even though he was arrogant, even though he was prideful, God still continued to give him the strength he needed to overcome the enemy. It wasn't until his pride became so full that he didn't even recognize God's presence in his life anymore. That's where things really fell apart. By the time that happened, Samson's arrogance and pride consumed him. He didn't realize that God was no longer with him. And as we're going to find out next week, it cost dude dearly. Samson had attributed so much of his past success to his gift rather than to the one who gave him that gift to begin with. It was never, God did this through me. It was always, I did this. Even when he addressed God himself. That it was by the hand of me that we accomplished this. His arrogance had consumed every part of him. And here's the thing. I know myself well enough to know, and I'm going to guess that you could probably agree with this, that I could probably allow my own pride, my own arrogance to consume me far too much. If we don't find some way to kill our pride, then we're going to face a very similar consequence to Samson. Maybe not quite as dramatic, but still just as costly. So what do we do, right? I mean, that's always the question that we have to come to. Like we talked about, how we need to kill our pride. Great. How do I do that? Well, the greatest opponent is humility. And that doesn't mean that we sit there and we talk about how terrible a person I am or how I'm the worst human being of all time. That's not what humility is. Humility, though, instead is rather we recognize the giver of the gift, that he is the one who's given me the ability to do this thing, that it's really only through him that this was able to happen, because if I was left to my own devices, I wouldn't have known what to do in that moment. It's recognizing that the giver of the gift is far more important, really, than even the gift itself, let alone the receiver of that gift. It's a recognition that God is greater than whatever else it is. That's what true humility is. And then once we have that humility, we can use those gifts that God has given us in service to our God by serving those around us. By using the gift that we have, the blessing that we've received, to bless those that are around us. And here's the thing, if we're spending our time in service to other people around us, we don't have time for pride anymore. I don't have time to reflect on how arrogant I am or how amazing I can be or how handsome I am or any of this other stuff. Instead, I'm focused on how do I help this person? So pride doesn't have time to enter the equation, let alone consume me. Pride is a plague. I cannot stress that to you enough. If there's one takeaway from Samson's story, it's not that he ripped a lion with his bare hands apart. It's not that he beat 1,000 dudes to death with the jawbone of a donkey. It's not any of the cool stuff that Samson did. It's the fact that in spite of all the amazing things that God did through him, Samson was the one who said, I did this. And his pride eventually caught up to him, just like it will catch up to you. But the story of Samson is not over. Yes, his pride cost him his strength. Yes, his pride cost him far more than that we're going to get into some. I'm going to do my best not to be too graphic because it's a family Sunday next week. But we are going to talk about some parts about Samson that we don't usually share in Sunday school class. But God's not done with him yet. Just like God's not done with you yet. Because we close out today with Judges chapter 16, verses 22, as it points us to a renewed hope. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved.